Welcome to the Book of Urm, Chapter 15, Heartland. Heartland. Piecora, Karui, Vinexi, and Serpendis were lowered to the ground slowly and carefully by long stretches of guyi lines, slings, and harnesses from the upper reaches of Kiahalla's canopy. Along the descent, Serpendis could see many leagues across the rolling hills and farmlands below as the sun slowly rose in the east. He knew that they were finally inside the eye of the encircling forest, the Scythian Heartland, as he learned it was called, and yet so vast were these fertile lands that he could not make out the other side and opposing edge of the forest. The fields and hills spread out before him like a tapestry woven with colorful exotic grasses, flowers, and plants only found here and nowhere else in the world. Rivers and streams snaked between hills and ran through open swaths of brightly colored wildflowers ignited by rays of the morning sun. Farmlands of various field patterns, fences, wells, and structures of thatched roofs and wood construction lay over the landscape for as far as the eye could see. In the far distance, Serpendis saw the great hill, taller than any other hill in the Heartland. It rose steeply like a conical butte. As a jewel upon a crown, a magnificent city stood both silhouetted by and glittering in the rays of the rising sun. Light bounced and refracted from its tall spires like angular prisms separating light into dazzling bands of color and kaleidoscopic frequencies. A barely perceptible high-pitched sound, like that of a distant tin whistle, carried on the winds originating from the city and added to the hypnotic otherworldliness of the Scythian Heartland. The companions finally touched down and stepped away from the guyi lines, each staring in different directions until their eyes arrived in unison at the sight of the distant hill and the crystalline city on top. Kiahalla was also with them, as he was eager to travel with them and could conceal them with his song of hiding if the need arose. On the ground, the wind blew in shifting, swirling, cycling currents infused with the rich, earthy, and pleasant scents of the surrounding tall grasses, wildflowers, and cultivated farmlands. For a long while, no one among the five companions said a word as they stood fastened within the moment of discovering Cynthia for the first time. It meant something different for each of them. For Serpendis's part, he felt infinitesimally small, unable to fully reconcile with the mortality of his life as barely an insignificant blip on the cosmic chronology of the world. He felt the power of incomprehensible time, ancient beyond measure and far outside the relatable framework of mortal humanity, simmering through his sandals from each granule of fertile soil beneath where he stood. He just could not believe what he was experiencing. He could not make it real for himself. He felt his mortal mind withering beneath the ancient presence of these mythical lands, and his greatest fear in the moment was that he would forget everything afterwards, that it never even happened, as his overstimulated mind would purge, at its earliest chance, every experience, every sense, every memory, from this time forward, like an over-intoxicated dream. For this he began to weep uncontrollably. After some abstraction of time had passed, he heard a nearby voice say, "There's a path." It was Piecora, and looking up, he saw her in the middle distance, standing among the blowing reeds and flowers, facing him. Hero cried overhead and swooped low over her as she slowly turned to face the distant landscape. Karui was further afield than Piecora, stepping carefully and slowly through the grass. Vinexi and Kiahalla stood beside Serpendis. Vinexi crouched with his face in his hands as Kiahalla looked around, sniffing the shifting winds. Serpendis pulled Vinexi up by the shoulder and said, "Come on, lad. Think of potatoes and gravy at the harlot's demise. Let's go." They caught up with Piecora and Karui and followed them along the narrow, winding track until the tree line behind them became a distant line of shadow as the sun reached its apex above them in the blue sky. The sun's warmth soothed Serpendis's many aching joints, sore muscles, and wounds accrued during the journey. They walked without any haste or pressure or sense of threat. Bees and insects buzzed all around them as they went about facilitating the complex life cycle of these timeless lands, the lands called the Undying Lands. In the distance, they saw an occasional deer raise its head to observe them, and many varieties of small birds flew above their heads. Higher in the sky circled larger hawk-like birds. Little things rustled in the grasses around them. Once, Serpendis spotted a little mole or mouse scurry briefly across the trail in front of them. The track continued until they reached a rise that sloped down on the other side into a gentle bowl where a small farmhouse stood. Beside the farmhouse stood a fenced paddock and rows of tilled earth. Paths of small, rounded stones connected a well and several gardens to the house. Around the property, tall grasses and wildflowers grew at will. Inside the paddock, the tilled rows, the gardens, and the stone paths. Karui spoke an elven greeting from where they stood overlooking the house below, but no answer came. After several moments, she spoke again, this time using several other dialects, including Banwarize. "Hello? We are travelers from beyond the forest. We mean no harm." Only the winds over the fields greeted them in answer. She turned to the group and said, "Perhaps no one is home." Piecora began descending the hill, and the rest followed. When they arrived and quietly explored the property, they found the farm completely empty and completely grown over. "Maybe it's for sale," Serpendis quipped, while peering into the house through one of its bare windows. "Spare furnishings inside, but barren. It's like nobody's been here for years." Grass tufts sprouted between rotten floorboards inside the main building. Mildew permeated the edges of the thatched roof, and sections of it had gone dark from decay. The tilled rows and gardens were filled with weeds and wildflowers. Piecora knelt in one of the gardens and ran her hands through the weeds. "I wonder what grew here," she said. Karui studied the well, noticing the only remnants of rope used to suspend a bucket to retrieve water were rotten and wound tightly around the crank spool above the well opening. "There's water at the bottom of the well, and I see the bucket there floating, but, a stench rises from it," Karui said, moving away from the well in disgust. "What does this say?" asked Vinexi, who stood before the front door of the little cottage. Above the door were runes carved into a wooden plaque, in some Fey tongue, given their shape and complexity. The plaque was pitted, rotted, and split from immense age. Lichen obscured some of the runes. "This is Elven script," Karui said, coming to join Vinexi from the well. Serpendis stood behind Vinexi, still grappling with his own sense of insignificance. Confronted with so much age that so much time had passed, so many lives were lived, so many generations came and went in another part of the world without him knowing even a single moment of any of it, almost physically hurt him. A pall of stillness hung in the air and over the grounds of the small farm, as if everything had already run its course, and he arrived too late. He imagined children laughing and playing in the gardens, pets chasing each other around the house, people raking and hoeing and digging in the areas of tilled ridges near the house. He tried to imagine smoke curling upwards from the chimney and the sweet, comforting aroma of wood smoke and cooked food. "This was a happy place at one time, I wager." "A blissful place," he said softly to himself. "Elves lived here, not Scythians," Karui said, still looking at the placard above the door. "I believe it is the name of the family. Mioa Kare, and beneath that, a number 18920103. "It's an address," said Serpendis, looking around him wildly at the surrounding landscape. "My, these lands were thriving at one time." "What do you mean?" asked Karui. "An address is a designation for one's home, where one lives, one's location in organized society," said Serpendis. "It's how you receive your mail, your packages, treats from your neighbors. It is how the authorities find you when you commit a crime, how you prove your identity when seeking a loan. A bit of a coming-of-age thing. Society deems you as worthy of adulthood when you've achieved an address of your own and all of the responsibilities and obligations that come with it, like taxes and bills. Based on the amount of numbers on that plaque, I'd say the Cynthian Heartland was teeming with life and activity. Maybe tens of millions of people lived here long ago. Gods, it makes my head spin." Karui of the nomadic Banwa knew nothing of such permanency as Serpendis described, and she was unsure if she could survive even one day in such a rigid and suffocating society. Piecora laughed. "Ah, Karui, that look on your face. You would never survive Canonian life. Sienyans, we are a bit in the middle between the Banwa and the bricklayers in the west. Our farms and households use family names to identify them, but Sienyans do not sit idly for long. It can be difficult to track one down if the need arises." Venexi approached Karui, turned, and pulled aside the back of his hair to reveal a series of marks and lines. "This is my address," Venexi said. "We are numbered, as are our homes and places of business within the district where we live. Our dear Muthan leaders keep us well organized, almost like cattle, if you will." "You are free of that now, son," said Serpendis. "Maybe I am," Venexi replied, "but we are not. One day I will change that." As the sun began to set for the first time since they entered the Cynthian Heartland, the group decided to spend the night inside the little house in case anyone might have discovered their activity and decided to come and investigate. They did not perceive any need to hide or any threat to avoid. In fact, they were anxious to meet someone as quickly as possible so they could negotiate help from the Cynthians to send them back home to the correct time and place within the primal realm where they were from. They all slept on the floor of the cottage without a fire or any of Karui's protections. Kiagri slept on the roof of the house, since being on the ground for any amount of time was uncomfortable for him, especially without any trees nearby. But watchful Siru was with him, and Siru did not require sleep. Hero slept in a thick knot of grasses some distance away from the cottage on the opposite hill from where the company first descended. Thus, the first day and the first night passed in Cynthia without event. Serpendis awoke to find Venexi still asleep next to him. Through a window, he could see Piecora performing fighting exercises in the soft morning light as the sun crept over the eastern horizon. He smelled cooked meat from somewhere, which made his mouth water. He stepped out of the cottage and said to no one in particular, "No visitors?" "No visitors," came a voice above and behind him. Turning and looking up, he saw Karui seated next to Kiagi, facing the sun. "Nor do I see any movement across the lands, only grass." "Perplexing a little bit," Serpendis said, covering his eyes with his hand as he surveyed his surroundings. "How about breakfast? Hero, what did you bring us this morning?" He followed his nose to Piecora's small cook fire, where she turned several small skinned animals over a spit, roasting them to perfection. "There's plenty of game," Piecora said. "We definitely will not starve." "We could fill our water, though," Karui said, while sliding down the thatched roof. "We need to find a stream." They ate in silence, dismantled the cook fire, and stamped out the embers before moving on. Always walking toward the distant city, they spread out and traveled side by side, but with space between each of them, unlike their single-file formation while hiking through the forest. They wanted to be as visible as possible and perceived no threats around them. For the rest of that second day, they wandered through the tall grasses and luminescent wildflowers, over gentle hills and shallow dales, through occasional copse of trees, and along gently winding streams. They encountered several more farms in various sizes and scales of operations, but all were vacant, in different degrees of disrepair, and heavily grown over. Furthermore, it was Piecora who began noticing signs of ruins and ancient civilization beneath the grass. Stopping suddenly on the top of a sloping bluff late in the afternoon, when the sun was sinking in the west, she claimed that she tripped over something hard. As she further investigated the object and dug around it, she discovered with amazement that it was the handle of a cart protruding from the ground. They decided to camp early in this location as she continued digging around the cart and exploring the area around it. Sitting around the fire later that night, beneath the stars and no moon, she displayed her discoveries before the companions. A small glass bottle, eating utensils, a curved knife blade, several arrowheads, and a metal helm with a puncture hole in the side, its edges facing inward. Designs of a serpent wrapped all the way around the ornate helm. "I think a fight happened here," Piecora said. "Imagine what else lies beneath us. I could spend an entire harvest here." "Let me see that helmet," Serpendis said. Piecora tossed it over the fire to him. He caught it with both hands. It rang with a dull, metallic sound. Holding it close to his face, he sniffed at it, then licked it briefly. "Lightweight, strong metal, but it's not iron. An alloy of some sort, I'd guess. After a good polish, I bet it could fetch a few coins, to say the least, given the thing's history." "Fey metal," said Karui. "Lighter than crude iron. It is said you can swim while wearing it. Only few among the Banwar wear such pieces of metal, and mainly for display only." "The history of this place," Piecora said, eyeing the curved blade in her hands. Glints of bright firelight reflected onto her face from the blade's metal as she turned it slowly over and over, layers upon layers of ages upon ages. "It is the oldest place in recorded history, where we are right now," Karui said. "It is where all elves come from, and the creation of the Fae." "What of the other peoples? Humans, dwarves, little people, orcs, goblins?" Serpendis asked. "Surely we do not all come from the elves." "I do not know of humans or dwarves or the halflings," said Karui. "Goblin kind, however, those of orcs and goblins and hobgoblins and trolls, bugbears and beastmen, misshapen and hastily conceived monsters, born from cruelty and serving only fear and violence. It is said among the Banwar that it was goblin kind that came before all else, even before Cynthia. The world was theirs in the pre-beginning. It belonged to them, and they nearly covered it, save for one place. These were the ancestors to goblin kind, the Norolth, before the counting of time and the numbering of years. Then Avanom came into the world, in the one place not yet spoiled by the Norolth, and the encircling forest was created to surround and protect him and the lands that were his home. The lands were Cynthia, and the encircling forest was Kiahalla, a barrier against the rest of the world. It is said that the Fae came into the world through the creation of the encircling forest and not by design. Thus, they are bound to this world. But she shook her head and sighed. "Forgive me. I recite lore that is long neglected and not spoken among the Banwar very much, except for a few of our elder shamans. Our own history is connected with this place, and yet we grow further distant from our origins with each passing generation. Many of us have no idea of our heritage or why it even matters to care. I fear one day it may all be forgotten." The following morning, sometime before dawn, Serpendis briefly awoke to 3 crows taking flight from the ground near their camp, each splitting off in different directions. They continued their journey toward the large city over many days. Some were clear with the sun rising and falling within the saturated blue sky of the Fey realm. Others brought gentle rains beneath a solid grey sky that muted all colors, as if the realm itself were finally succumbing to long overdue fatigue after countless ages of existence. On these rainy days in particular, Serpendis felt lethargic, and the vitality gifted to him by the Fey realm seemed absent. He imagined his face in the mirror as old and drawn downward, with deep wrinkles and heavy eyes that had seen more in his mortal life than his body and mind were capable of handling. Also, during these days of rain, it became more apparent with each discovery of the past that the overgrown hills and valleys of the Cynthian Heartland they now tread upon were once thriving with innumerable farms and villages of many sizes and densities, bustling with constant activity, interconnected by a complex network of paved roads, heavily trafficked by carts, wagons, horses, and travelers. They began to wonder about the nature of the current topography, that perhaps long ago these lands were flat, and each hill, each depression, each river, stream, lake, and pond were remnants of an ancient civilization reclaimed by thousands of years of natural growth. One particular rainy day, Serpendis stopped on one such hill and shouted through the precipitation, "If this is the Fey realm, what of our own world? What do these lands look like in the primal realm? Where is everyone? Did they all leave and go to our world? Did we just miss them? That would be just our luck." Karui, Piecora, and Vinexi turned back and looked up at Serpendis with tired, pale, wet faces. Kieragri clung to Piecora's shoulders, and Hero rested on her outstretched wrist. "We've not met a single soul since our arrival, only ruins long buried beneath ages of time. Where are the Cynthians?" he cried. "I don't know," Karui shouted back. "I only hope to find answers in the city." Serpendis slumped his shoulders and descended the hill to join with the others. His knees hurt, and every joint and muscle ached. He felt bent with age on days like this, and after all they had been through to finally get to Cynthia, he began to worry that their troubles might be far from over. One morning he awoke to find Karui alone, seated on a lower branch of a solitary oak tree. Beyond her he could see in great detail the looming face of the steep conical hill and the crystalline city on top. The city was merged into the hill as if it sprang organically from it. The buildings, spires, domes, and structures reminded him of exposed crystal geodes that he would sometimes come across in the markets of Coast Haven, except instead of one single type of gem represented in each broken stone, the city before him in the distance seemed to be of all gems of the world and more. The crystal structures grew upward from the tall butte in varying odd angles, and the sun's light danced and played on the city's surfaces like thousands of prisms clustered together. Here and there, tiny flocks of white cliff-dwelling birds flew along the side of the butte like undulating flecks of white paint. The high-pitched, multifaceted note carried by the morning breeze from the city seemed clearer to his ears now than before. Within the midst of the city a single gargantuan tree grew, larger than anything Serpendis had ever seen before. In fact, he was certain that not any single person living outside the encircling forest could even comprehend the size and scale of the tree. It towered over the crystalline structures of the city like a mountain draped in shredded clouds. Its branches and leaves moved in the high-altitude winds like vast, distant combined forests seen from thousands of leagues away. Serpendis continued his gaze upward, following the great tree's height all the way until its upper reaches faded into the sky, obscured by clouds. Flocks of birds of many different kinds and sizes flew around and within the tree's colossal boughs and branches. Serpendis's wide eyes streamed fresh tears down his face as he stared blankly at the omnipresent sight, suddenly afraid and feeling ill-equipped to go any further. Aeonwyrm, city of Cynthia that lies on the hill of Gorai, and the mother tree called Shurai, Karui said. We are in a holy place, ancient beyond any of our understanding. I find it hard to believe it myself. I can't go any further, Serpendis muttered in a hushed voice. He felt dizzy, nauseous, and witless. An all-encompassing fear gripped him unlike anything he felt before. I don't belong here. There is no turning back, Serpendis, Karui said. That is our way home. We must all face it together. Serpendis swayed on his feet when a hand touched his shoulder. Quite a sight, isn't it, old man? Nobody will believe us back home, Piecora said, coming up from behind him. Nobody will ever believe what we are seeing right now. Takes the breath away. Though her voice trembled, it also soothed him. Spirits, you're shaking, she said, turning to him. How could you not be? He stammered unsteadily. She said, Hold yourself together, merchant. I am afraid too, we all are. None of us belong here, not even Karui. But this is our only way home. The Cynthians are good people, they will help us. Just keep thinking on that. We are right on the cusp now. The adventure is almost over. When you are back in your bed in Kananaya, you will wish you spent a little more time here. You'll think it was all a dream. Cherish this moment. No one back home will be able to see what you see today or tomorrow. Vinexi came up and joined them from the camp and stared up at the towering sight before them. He said nothing, but his face was like that of a pained, perplexed teenager trying to make sense of something utterly foreign and baffling him. Is that where we've been heading toward since leaving the forest? Karui spun around on her branch to face them. Another few days or so ahead of us, I think, until we arrive. They will help us? Vinexi asked, his voice filled with doubt. We have nothing to fear from them, Karui said. Her command of the low Canonian common tongue had advanced over the last few weeks, during their stay with the Abrignalians, and she replied with it more often instead of falling back to Banwarese. They are the forebears of elvenkind. They stand for all that is pure and true. They may be surprised to see us, given the dangers of the encircling forest, but when they hear our plea, they will help us. What makes you think we will even find anyone at all in the city? To me, it appears that Cynthia has been abandoned, Serpendis said. I have been wondering that same thing over the last few days. My best guess, based on the stories sung among the Banwa, is that there has been some kind of withdrawal, perhaps over the long years, since Vioyan fell asleep within Shurai after the Kindred War. Maybe the country fell into a sadness, an apathy, and the once joyous life of both Eldar and elvenkind who lived throughout the Heartland surrounding Aeonwyrm diminished over time, and gradually the people receded to the city to be closer to the Mother Tree and their sleeping goddess queen. I'm hopeful we will meet Cynthians in Aeonwyrm. Or it could have been worse, Serpendis said. There could have been fighting, struggles for power in the absence of leadership. Perhaps Cynthia fell into civil war after the slaying of the Hyolangorn, isolated from the rest of the world by Kiahalla. Perhaps they destroyed themselves, hidden from the world, and thus the world never knew it. Dire thoughts, said Karui, looking back at glimmering Aeonwyrm in the pale distance. A light droning caught their attention, and on a branch above, Karui appeared Kiagri, watching them intently. Let's be going then, Piecora said. The sooner we get there, the quicker we'll have answers to these riddles." Over the next several days, the company walked ever nearer toward the looming presence of Gorai, the steep-sided mass of igneous rock, rising like a wide, conical obelisk from the surrounding hills and prairies of the Scythian Heartland. It nearly filled their vision now when they looked toward it in the northeast, and as the sun set each day, Gorai cast its shadow over the company like a creeping shade over the lands. On day 3, Serpendis could see deep, vertical grooves within the steep side of the towering hill, with color striations ranging from dark gray to weathered brown, with patches of green, where grass, moss, and even a few gangly trees grew on outcroppings and areas most exposed to the elements. Around the hill, the land rose sharply into foothills of sedimentary sandstone, shale, and gypsum. They followed a road wider, more established, and less overgrown than the other paths and trails they encountered across the Heartland. Serpendis surmised that this road was wider than both East and West Mares put together. The East Mare and West Mare were two of Kananaya's most heavily traveled roads, each flanking the great Angriluin River as it curved through the center of his home country, flowing south from the Crystal Sea and emptying into the Salt Sea. This road they now walked was wide enough to fit all of them comfortably side by side. It was made with flat stones of varying hues of deep red, orange, and gray, perfectly fitted and joined together with a grout that reminded Serpendis of Vlanstraden's stone and tile work. Vlanstrad, one of Kananaya's 7 cities and city of Athena, boasted many of Kananaya's most advanced civil engineering techniques that included building material, bridges, fountains, canals, wells, archways, and roads. But Vlanstrad was plain, angular, and overly practical, without a sense of need for beauty, at least according to Serpendis's tastes. Vlanstrad boasted strength and practicality over aesthetics, and although he might argue their city was boring and not enough effort or cost was spent toward even a minimal amount of flourish, he also knew one could eat from the streets and drink straight from the canals, so clean and well-maintained the city was. Serpendis's thoughts returned from Vlanstrad as he admired the beauty of the road passing beneath his sandals with each step. He wondered what its name was, and he tried to imagine the crowds of people coming and going in days long past. Although now cracked with age, choked with weeds, and covered in patches of moss and mildew, he could clearly see the aesthetic effort on the placement of the angular shale and sandstone pieces as they fit together. The road sloped slightly in the middle, and trenches ran along either side to catch runoff. Here and there, Serpendis saw rusted metal grates within these trenches, leaving him to wonder if there was an entire aqueduct or sewer system beneath these lands. Despite the majesty and discovery of Cynthia realized with each new day of the rising and setting sun, their travel toward Aeonwyrm remained empty of any sight, sound, or sign of living inhabitants except for the local wildlife. Every structure, every farm, every house, every village, everything had been reclaimed by the hills and grasses of the Heartlands, seemingly over the course of centuries. The same question lingered heavily over each companion as they strode along the empty, overgrown thoroughfare toward their destination, looming high overhead. Where was everyone? Several more days passed as their journey on the road gradually transitioned from winding through hills and prairies to a straight upward slope over loose stones and exposed earth of the foothills surrounding Gorai. Here the road opened even wider, and there was no telling its actual full width, as its sides were covered by years of rockfalls and wind-swept dirt and clay from the towering stone monolith before them. Craning their heads back and looking up, they could no longer see any sight of the crystal spires of Aeonwyrm, as they were too near to the sides of Gorai. Up ahead, where the road met the base of Gorai at its widest, was a large, circular opening in the side of the tower, about 100 meters high at its apex. Footpaths led from the road on either side and rose up and around the sides of the tower, disappearing around the tower's curvature. Long, twisting vines and straggling bracken dangled like pieces of a torn curtain in the lair's opening. Wisps of leaves and dust devils blew in front of the large opening, and the breeze whistled slightly as it passed through it. "Gods, is it hollow on the inside?" Serpentis wondered aloud. Coming nearer to the threshold, they found the road and stonework continued into the base of the monument through the large opening. The curvature of the opening was perfectly measured and engineered despite its current state, where several cracks had formed within its stone structure, and gaps were present where loose rocks had fallen. There was no light inside, except for what was provided from the outside, and they couldn't see any further from that. Karui wandered inside first, followed closely by Piecora. Hiero flew in as she disappeared into the darkness. Vinexi stayed behind with Serpentis, and Kiagri clambered up the side of the opening. "What do you see?" Serpentis called into the opening. "Come inside, see for yourself. Your eyes will adjust quickly," Piecora responded. Serpentis laid a hand on Vinexi and said, while gathering as much inner strength as he could possibly muster, "Come on, lad. Into the unknown we go." They walked inside and found themselves within an extraordinarily large, empty, cavernous space. The ground was flat, with grouted natural stones, like the road outside. The ceiling of the interior was domed, with exposed lattices of crisscrossing beams of rough-hewn, curving and twisting timber, each 3 to 4 meters wide, like they had grown naturally from within the cave's upper walls and ceiling. They walked all the way through the wide, dark interior until they reached the back of the cave. Looking back at the entrance they came from, Serpentis guessed that the cave must be several hundred meters deep and wide. The walls on either side and the back wall were natural stone without any features, except for 3 openings on the left and right sides, and one large, wide opening in the back wall. Within each opening there was a soft, ambient light filtering from above that Serpentis didn't notice when viewing the cave from the outside. Just then, light rain began drifting down outside of the cave entrance, further diminishing the diffused light outside and deepening the darkness inside. In the back of the cave, a cool breeze flowed out from the wide opening in the rear wall, and rain came gently down through all the shafts in the chamber, creating a soft omnipresence of echoing rain hitting the wet floors within each opening. The surrounding layered sounds of the rain from the shafts of grey daylight in the walls, and the cool darkness of the empty cavern itself created an air of alien mystery, unfamiliarity, and dread that none of the companions had ever experienced before. Here, inside the very infrastructure of their final destination, the fabled city of Aeonwyrm, the immortal city at the heart of the Undying Lands, and there were no other sounds except for the rain and the whistling of the breeze. Try as he might, Serpentis felt lacking in any fundamental tools of his own understanding, whether learned from education or experienced in life, to develop even basic foundational theories regarding the functionality of a large space like this beneath the city, or the culture that built it. Again, he felt feeble, tiny, and completely at the mercy of unknown powers around him. Piecora slowly, cautiously, stepped into the large opening in the rear wall and looked up, her face suddenly illuminated from shadow by the open sky far above. She squinted as raindrops splashed on her face. "Open to the sky," she muttered to herself, but her voice carried to the others still in the darkness of the cavern. Walls are smooth, like polished stone or glass. Serpendis stepped into the shaft with her, judging it to be about 30 meters wide and 20 meters deep. Its walls were perfectly curved stone, smooth and polished to the extent that he could almost see an approximation of his reflection. He looked up into the rain and saw a pinprick of daylight at the very top, impossible to judge its height. "Strange design for storing grain," he said, scratching his head. "Or stabling horses," Piecora said, running her fingers along the smooth walls of the chamber lit from above. Rivulets of water and raindrops collected and redirected where her fingers touched the glass surface. "How were they even devised? I don't even see any tool marks," asked Serpendis, kneeling to study the walls of the curved chamber. Karui, with Kiagri on her shoulders, stepped in and looked around. Vinexi followed. "Gods, I cannot," Serpendis began, but then the platform beneath them began rising slowly up through the shaft. Hero flew in at the last moment before the platform disappeared from the ground-level opening. He then flew straight upward through the height of the shaft and disappeared into the open air above them. Neither the platform nor the surrounding chamber made a single sound, except for the rain. "The platform is lifting. We're rising through the mountain. How?" asked Serpendis, falling to his knees at the sudden movement. Looking down, he saw the natural stone-tiled ground receding beneath them. The floor. "It's glass, a singular piece of glass." The interior stonework of the great tower of Gorai slowly moved downward as the platform climbed in elevation. Serpendis, leaning against the side, jumped away from the wall out of instinctual fear he would be caught and dragged down between the platform and the wall. But then he realized that a thin layer of glass lay between them and Gorai's interior. "This shaft, it's glass. We're inside a column of glass," he stammered, looking around him in fear and wonder as the hill's inner core moved slowly down past them, but his reflection remained within the sides of the shaft. Karui curiously touched the wall with her finger again, and the platform gently came to a halt. She looked back at the others, and they all stared at her. She touched it again, and the platform began lowering until she touched it a third time. "You can make it move?" Serpendis said. "It only responds to you," Piecora said. "Crystal," Karui said, then stood in silence for several moments while the rain continued to softly fall. Finally she said, "There are a few tales sung among us that speak of Scythians and their use of gems and crystals in Aeonwyrm. I believe we are inside a crystal, a column of crystal, and it is tuned only to the Fae." "Tuned?" asked Serpendis incredulously. "Like an instrument, tuned to a sound that cooperates with other sounds, resonation, harmony, dissonance, light and darkness. The Scythians use crystal to shape and harness these things." She placed her palm against the side of the crystal shaft, and the surrounding rock faded away from all around them, as one slowly blinks their eyes. They were now many hundreds of meters in the air, and all around them lay the Scythian Heartland below. Rain clouds hung just above their heads as they lazily moved across the landscape. The inner edge of the encircling forest could almost be seen in its entirety, but its outer edge met the horizon and faded from view. Beneath them they saw the road they traveled on when they arrived was only one of many other roads that connected to the Gorai on all sides, radiating outward like rays from the sun. Her friends cowered and fell on the invisible platform as if the roof collapsed on them, and Vinexi curled into a fetal ball of sheer terror. Karui remained motionless, taking in the surrounding view, and Kiagri stood up on Karui's shoulders, looking around him in pure joy and amazement, purring softly to himself as he beheld a view of the world that no other Abrignalian had ever seen. The stories he would tell his mother, Matron Mozeltwag. Karui released her hand from the crystal, and the dark core of Gorai returned around the crystal column. Then she stood silent for long moments, deep in thought. "'Tis pure magic," Serpendis finally muttered, looking up into the rain above him. "All around us is magic. None of this is real. How can we survive this?" "It is real, but not magic," Karui said, turning to face them. "Rather, I believe the Scythians have a collective understanding of the world far greater than any other people outside of the encircling forest. They are ancient beyond measure. They began the historical record of the world since the creation of Avanom and the coming of Vioyen, and they are immortal, dying only when life is stolen from them or when they choose. They have lived for many ages in isolation from the rest of the world, taking their culture far beyond any other." She tapped the crystal wall again with her finger, and the platform began rising again. "Hold fast, Canonian," she continued. "We are now where so few from the outside have come before. Who knows what else there is that we cannot understand, and yet exists before us?" Serpendis slumped against the side of the glass elevator, feeling an inevitable doom begin to overtake him, as if his mind and body could not outlast the toll of fatigue the Fey realm exacted from him. He wondered quietly if the increased vitality he felt from this world were merely the expediting of his mortality, and with this sobering thought he no longer saw a return to his soft bed, or the laughter of his nieces and nephews, or baked potatoes and fine wine at the harlot's demise, as reasonable expectations. Opening his eyes, he looked longingly at Piecora and felt shame from these sobering thoughts. He looked up into the rain and the grey light of day at the end of the crystalline column. "She risked everything for me," he thought to himself. "It is for her that I should survive to see my home again." Thank you for listening to this chapter from the Book of Urm. If you enjoyed this reading, like and subscribe to our channel, and consider supporting us at the Book of Urm at patreon.com.